It was one of the darkest days in American history and the most horrifying public events of the 20th century.
Something has happened in the motorcade. Stand by, please.
He was slumping down, and the second shot went off, and it just knocked him down.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Decades later, Kennedy's assassination is still a global mystery.
The assassination of John F. Kennedy matters because the world changed that day.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Personally, he's the greatest president we ever had. And you know how you know that? He served the least amount of time. They wouldn't even let him do one term. That showed his greatness.
Who took that fatal shot that killed the president? Why was he the target? And what was the motive behind the killing?
There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin.
Kennedy was looking for détente with both the Cubans and the Russians. Kennedy wanted peace.
Join us as we explore one of history's most complex, unsolved mysteries. This is the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the ultimate conspiracy.
Conspiracies have always been around. I mean, if you look back through history, you'll find there's always been doubt in authority, and there have always been authorities that have done doubtful things. And the view that conspiracies are modern, or indeed the theories about them are modern, is plainly untrue. And you can go back into history and find many indications that people, they knew that they were not told the truth by the powers that be, but they had to kind of go along with it, because what else do you do? And you can go back to the Roman times and find some, very modern-looking ideas about conspiracy. And there were plots and assassination attempts and assassinations, but also most people knew that, the powers at the top didn't have their interests at heart. But you had to go along with what they said, but didn't mean you actually believed them. So where we are today, the technology is different. The means of communicating conspiracies is different. But in essence, we still doubt authority. We still believe that those at the top might not be doing the best things for us. They're doing the best things for them. But every now and then, something will come along where somebody might try and make a change at the top, and then they might get taken out, which creates a whole new set of conspiracy theories.
Conspiracy theories throughout the years have only grown in popularity throughout countries around the world. From UFOs to the New World Order, citizens everywhere have been asking important and key questions as they try to explore some of the world's darkest secrets. But it was President Kennedy's assassination in 1963 that was the case that truly triggered this rise in questioning, with people always asking, what really happened on that day?
The assassination of John F. Kennedy matters, and it matters still, because the world changed that day. And although it's a long time ago now, and the hope does seem to be that it will fade away into history and we'll stop worrying about it, if you go down the wider conspiracy view that it wasn't just one man firing a gun, then it means that there were powers that existed back then that were willing to actually remove a leader by murder, who of course would therefore have influenced the world ever after. And although the individuals that might have been involved in setting up that assassination are, almost certainly not with us today, the bodies that they represented, the powers that they were fronting, clearly they do still exist. That is a concern, because it means that, the world has long been at the mercy of people willing to kill for what they want, and, willing to try to muddy the waters ever since so that we can never quite identify them. So it matters, because if you perpetrate a crime and you get away with it, then it will surely lead to the thought, well, we can do that lots of times. And then maybe the crimes get bigger, and therefore, the consequences become graver for all of us. And inevitably, the conspiracy theories around it will get bigger as well. But that sometimes is justified.
It was here in Dallas, Texas, on the 22nd of November 1963, where everything began. Kennedy was massively popular, and that was plain to see as he landed in Air Force One at 11:30 a.m. Traveling through Main Street, crowds filled to see a glimpse of their beloved president. But while turning off of Main Street and onto Daley Plaza, Kennedy was to be shot dead by an assassin sniper. But who could have possibly been behind this harrowing assassination? Who pulled that trigger?
On the day of the assassination of Kennedy, 22nd of November, 1963, we had, if you like, an event that, was normal. It was a parade, it was the president in an open-top car. But it was just a wonderful thing. He was visiting Texas, and people were lining the streets. They were out to see him. And the official story says that one man, Lee Harvey Oswald, was somebody who had a grudge against the president. He had certainly Marxist leanings. He, well, on the surface at least, appeared to resent what had happened in Cuba, which he blamed Kennedy for. So he took a gun and he went to one of the rooms in the Texas School Book Repository and basically shot Kennedy as the cars were going by. He was apprehended soon after. He murdered a police officer, Officer Tippit, while he was, allegedly on the run, and was then finally apprehended in a cinema. And so history says, that's it. There was one man, and it was a terrible thing, and now we don't need to worry.
Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and charged with the murder of Officer J.D. Tippit and President John F. Kennedy. It appeared to be a case-closed situation, as the man responsible for the killing of the beloved president had been captured. Some witnesses opposite the Texas School Book Depository stated that Oswald was indeed the man behind the shooting. But why would this American citizen kill his president? What was the underlying reason for his involvement in this world-changing assassination?
Oswald had been a US Marine, and not a bad Marine, although that said he was court-martialed twice. He accidentally shot himself in the elbow on one occasion. He was fond of guns, but then he left the Marines, and afterwards he went to live in the Soviet Union. He became a defector. Or at least that's what we're told. Many believe that in fact he was a double agent, and that the defection was a setup, and that in fact all along he was working probably for the CIA. But nonetheless, he went to live in Russia. He and his wife Marina weren't happy there, and eventually they came back to the United States, That's when he began to sort of get very concerned about what was going on in Cuba, and would give out leaflets on the streets complaining about the way the Cubans were being treated. Kennedy had been behind an attempted invasion of Cuba using Cuban exiles trained by the CIA. But then when, this actually happened, he didn't give it the full force. He didn't give air cover. These people were either killed or captured very quickly. And it was, it is often described as the Bay of Pigs fiasco.
As I've said from the beginning, the operation was a failure, and that the responsibility rests with the White House.
So Oswald was apparently very upset by this and had a grudge, therefore, against him on that alone, but also because he had, maybe communist leanings. Oswald said he had Marxist leanings, and there is a difference between those two, but nonetheless, it gets mixed together in the public mind. So Kennedy had become somebody that stood for everything that he didn't. And officially, at least, we're told that, he just wanted to see this figure taken down, and so began his plot to kill him.
Questions have also been asked alongside this regarding Oswald's involvement. One question which was asked was, could Oswald have even been able to be within the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository before 12:30 on the 22nd November, and ready to take those alleged shots? Does the minute-by-minute account add up? Or was this a plot to pass the blame on to an easy target who had Soviet links?
We do know that Oswald was in the building that day. He was seen happily drinking Coke at about 12:15. Now, the assassination occurred at 12:30, but what's of note is that it was expected that the parade would go past at 12:15. Unless somebody had managed to tip Oswald off that it had been delayed, and it was delayed because they stopped to talk to more people than had been expected, you would have expected that Oswald would have been in place at 12:15, rather than nonchalantly drinking Coke and just wandering around. You would think he'd want to be in place, and he wasn't. And then after the shooting, he doesn't make a quick attempt to leave the building. Now, some believe he was only a decoy all along, that he didn't fire any shots, or if he did, he was mainly the decoy, the one that people hoped would be found and would then take the blame. Others believe that actually the original idea was to kill Oswald very quickly anyway. But it does seem strange that he didn't make an attempt to immediately leave the building. He was seen again calmly drinking, and a police officer came in, because by now, of course, they were searching the building. He did confront Oswald, but a man with him working there said, no, he's fine, he's one of our employees, ignore him. And then Oswald quietly left the building. But then you have the strangeness that Oswald went back, I think, to his home initially, and then he went out onto the streets, and then by then, a description had gone out of the man that the police were looking for. And it's unclear as to exactly why they thought Oswald suddenly was the killer, but nonetheless, that's the description that went round. Police officer Tippett saw Oswald from his patrol car and called Oswald, came out of the car to question him, and we are told Oswald suddenly shot him at point-blank range and then ran away. But even that is unclear, because some of the witnesses to that say there were 2 men involved with the shooting. Some say Oswald was not one of them. Some say one of them looked a bit like Oswald. But that's when Oswald then ran away, having shot the police officer, and then managed to find his way into a cinema. And somebody saw him go in, he was followed, the police arrived, they surrounded the cinema, and then they entered the cinema and the film was stopped, and there was Oswald sitting there. Interestingly, Oswald seems to have had an intimation that actually the police might have wanted to have killed him very, very quickly. I think he suspected that, because in the cinema, when they finally surrounded him, he shouted very loudly, "I am not resisting arrest, I am not resisting arrest," which meant that, of course, had they shot him dead at that point, they could have said, well, you know, he wasn't resisting arrest. He said he wasn't. He shouted that to the people in the cinema. They heard that. So he was almost protecting himself there by doing that, just to make sure they couldn't take him out then and there. I think there are many doubts as to whether he was really the main gunman, even if he fired some of the shots. You know, I think it's very clear that there is another story there to be told.
Regardless of the minute-by-minute account not quite adding up, Oswald had been brought to justice by the Texas Police Department, and the country seemed to accept the fact that Oswald was the man behind the assassination. But on the 24th of November, the day after he was charged with the 2 murders, Oswald was to face his penalty by the hands of a regular, everyday citizen. That citizen was Jack Ruby.
Captain Fritz. There is Lee. He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's a man with a gun. Absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas.
But this event, which was broadcast on live television to the whole world, only added to the mystery behind the assassination and triggered more questions.
Oswald was killed by a man called Jack Ruby. Now, Ruby owned a nightclub. It was a strip club. It was a sleazy world. He was connected to the mob. That was his world. We are told, though, that he was so, outraged by what Oswald had done that he just wanted to take revenge on behalf of the American people and managed somehow to gain access to the back of the police station just as Oswald was being taken out and literally shot him in the abdomen at point-blank range. So the story at the time was he was just doing it, because of his own personal motivations. And that then, of course, raised concerns because some wondered, was that it? Or was he removing Oswald because somebody didn't want Oswald's testimony to be heard? Now, it soon became clear that, in fact, Ruby had a lot of influence in the community. He certainly would have known people that might have enabled him to get to that part of the police station where the average person wouldn't have got inside of. And also, you then get the strangeness that follows when Ruby, as he is now in jail, begins to make statements. And perhaps Ruby had been told, if you do this, you'll do your time, but then you'll be a big hero, everyone will love you, you'll be very rich, and you can, write your story about it. But that it became clear, once he was in captivity, that he wasn't going to be released. And he then started to make statements. There's a famous press conference that he actually holds in the jail, where he begins to drop hints that there was a wider conspiracy to kill Kennedy, and that he knew more than he was letting on. He was convicted for the killing of Oswald, but he then appealed, and it was going to go to a second trial. And that's when he began to get louder in his claims that there was something strange going on, and that he believed that he also would be perhaps murdered. He was being given injections in the jail, and he didn't know what they were. He wasn't a well man. Ruby had cancer. But he believed that perhaps they were trying to poison him, to kill him. And sure enough, he then died in the police cells before he got to the second trial.
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives. The people that had so much to gain and had such a material motive for putting me in a position I'm in. We'll never let the true facts come above board to the world.
Now, these people are in very high positions, Jack?
Yes.
So then he also had been removed, and perhaps information that would have come out at that second trial, that never came out.
Jack Ruby stated that killing Oswald was an emotional, patriotic response, as he wanted to punish him for plunging the country into a dark despair. But was this another lie being told to the citizens of America? Was there a link between Jack Ruby, Lee Harvey Oswald, and the assassination of John F. Kennedy?
There was a lady called Rose Cherami. She worked at the strip club. She was a heroin addict, and by that point in her life was in a bit of a sad state. But interestingly, she had been picked up by the police a few days before the shooting of Kennedy. And she, in her babbling, had said that she was aware of a plot to kill Kennedy, and that Ruby and Oswald were working together. She had seen them. She believed that they may have been having a sexual relationship together. She believed that she'd seen other people hanging around that may have been from the intelligence services, which of course then paints a completely different picture, because that would then suggest that Ruby and Oswald knew each other, almost certainly then would have both been part of the plot to kill Kennedy, and that Ruby's killing of Oswald was a way of stopping Oswald ever testifying. Therefore, of course, it begins to look like a much more tangled web. And then that's made even stranger by the fact that shortly after, all of this came to light and Ruby began to make his statements, Rose Cherami herself was then found dead, apparently hit by a car lying by the side of a road. So you've then got the beginning of this succession of people who are dying in strange circumstances. And it begins to look like to some that, witnesses are being taken out one by one. And indeed, other people connected to the Kennedy shooting who saw things on that day. There's a lot of people that believe, if you look at how they died and how early they died in their lives, that there was a program to remove some of the key witnesses. So you go further and further down, the layers get deeper and deeper, and of course, the conspiracy theories grow ever more complex, and yet perhaps justifiably so.
By the end of the week, Dallas had played witness to 3 different murders: John F. Kennedy's, Officer J.D. Tippit, and Lee Harvey Oswald. Jack Ruby had also been arrested and given life in prison. But after all these events, Lee Harvey Oswald was still being labeled clearly as the man behind the murder. But on that fateful day where President Kennedy was assassinated, the first bullet that hit President Kennedy was said to hit him, going through his back, exiting his neck, going through Texas Governor John Connally's arm, and lodging itself in his leg. This shot raised many questions. How was it possible that one bullet could cause so many entry wounds without breaking? Could this have been just one single shot? And on top of that, was Oswald even able to hit President Kennedy with his rifle from that distance?
Magic bullet theory. This is the way it works. Here's Lee Harvey Oswald up on the 6th floor of the book depository building. And here comes the president's limousine. As you see, right in front of the building, almost parks under Oswald's window. At this point, Oswald could take his rifle and drop it out the window, confident that he will hit somebody in that limousine. But does he? Does he fire? Oh, no. Being somewhat of a sport, Oswald waits until the car speeds into the distance. And then Oswald fires the first shot, and the bullet hits the president in the back of the neck, leaving behind a hole in his jacket 6 inches below his shoulder. Leaving behind a hole in his shirt 6 inches below his shoulder, and leaving behind a hole in his back 6 inches below the shoulder. The bullet then exits from the president's throat, leaving behind a small wound of entrance.
During the fatal shot that ended Kennedy's life, a passionate amateur filmmaker, Abraham Zapruder, captured the full assassination on his 8mm camera while standing on a hill a few yards from the road. The film highlighted another important factor that the officials seemed to be ignoring. This was the angle in which John F. Kennedy's body fell after the shot hit him in the head. Witness reports on the day also backed this up, stating they heard gunshots coming from the right-hand side of President Kennedy's motorcade, up on the grassy knoll.
When you look at the way the shots appeared to hit the president, it's quite hard to believe that all of those shots came from behind, which is what we're told. So Oswald waited for the cars to go by and then he took the shot from behind. That's what we're told. But if you look at the film, it does look very much as if the president, in the final shot which takes him out, one shot's fired, it misses, another shot goes through basically Kennedy's back, neck, and then goes on to hit a number of other bits of John Connolly. Then the final shot takes out the president and you see his head explode. But it does look as if he's recoiling from a shot that has come from the front. And he sort of recoils backwards and his head goes to the left. And that, to many people, is not in keeping with the shot that is coming from behind. Now, the autopsy, supported ultimately the final Warren Commission's verdict that it was a shot only from behind. But there are many doubts about the autopsy photographs. Some believe that between the body of the president being taken to Parkland Hospital and then to where the autopsy took place, that the body was actually tampered with to conceal the evidence that the shot came from behind. So we know, for instance, that there was a shot that went through Kennedy's neck and exited here, but of course, was it an exit wound? Or was it a bullet actually coming in again from the front? Some people believe they redressed the wounds to make it look like ultimately the shots had come from the other way around. So there are doubts as to whether some of the photographs we see are even showing Kennedy's head in its damaged state. But some say, well, it was Kennedy's head, but they basically pushed it around to make it look like the shot had come from behind and not from the front. But the minute that you say there's even the possibility that that shot might have come from the front, then you have to say there were other gunmen.
The grassy knoll has now become famous as people continue to ask, could this have been the location where a fatal shot was fired from? But despite the Warren Commission's statement that there was only one shooter, witnesses on the scene continue to defend the fact that they definitely saw a selection of suspicious individuals on the grassy knoll on that day. But who were they? And could they have been possibly involved in President Kennedy's assassination?
The theories that there was more than one gunman, of course, are going to revolve around what was seen and heard on the day as much as what was seen in the film. So the grassy knoll, and if you see some of the images, you'll see quite a few people were sitting on the grass or standing there. A number of people claimed that they heard shots coming from over the fence. Some of them did try to testify this to the Warren Commission, which is, largely seen as a whitewash, the initial investigation. Interestingly, the Warren Commission said they would only consider evidence from people at the grassy knoll if their evidence concurred that there was only the lone gunman, Oswald. Now, that immediately looks suspicious. So in other words, anybody who gave testimony that believed that shot came from over the fence was not listened to, or their testimony was not included. So that immediately looks suspicious. Then you have tales of people being in different positions in Dealey Plaza. There is a man with an umbrella who's standing looking a little bit odd. Some have wondered, did he fire one of the shots? Was there even a gun concealed as part of the umbrella? We're getting into James Bond stuff here, but nonetheless, things like that have happened in history, not impossible. But then you get the strange tramps. So there were three men who were dressed in tramps' clothing, except for one of them looked a little bit smarter than that. They were hovering around the fence where some of the shooters are claimed to have been, or at least one of them. Now, later on, people did find them, they did identify them, and although the belief of some was that they were CIA men, some have said, no, they actually really were tramps. But that then, of course, leads to another theory. But what kind of tramps? And were they firing guns and so on? So you've got the strange tramps as well. And, I mean, there are many different characters who claim they were there on the day. Some, retrospectively, have gone out of their way to claim that they were actually, shooting bullets. We also have tales of E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis. Now, Howard Hunt, some say, might have been one of the tramps. Hunt and Sturgis would eventually go on to be two of the Watergate burglars. The whole story of Watergate is fascinating because the burglars that went into the Watergate building, apparently as part of a political espionage attempt from the Republicans, they were breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Hunt and Sturgis years later said the reason they broke into that building was to retrieve incriminating photographs that would have shown CIA men standing in very, compromising positions at Dealey Plaza, including at the Grassy Knoll. And some believe that Hunt himself was indeed one of the shooters. So, there's a whole industry now of looking at all the people that were at Dealey Plaza, looking at what they did later on and the claims they made, and it gets ever deeper and ever more fascinating.
I absolutely feel that it was a minimum triangular crossfire. That would be the standard. If you're going to take somebody out, that's how you're trained to take them out. I would say there was a minimum of probably at least 3 weapons fired.
Theories went a lot deeper than those individuals seen on the grassy knoll. In 1963, a film entitled 7 Days of May was in production. The narrative of the film was set around a military coup to take over the President of the United States.
Suggesting, Mr. President, there's a military plot to take over the government. This may occur sometime this coming Sunday.
And I will not resign voluntarily.
I'm going to fight you.
And then we'll see which one of us the United States is willing to follow.
A controversial topic, which in hindsight looks to have been extremely coincidental with the events that followed, and led to the film being delayed until 1964. This was a Hollywood film, however, but its topic certainly was a talking point. But could it have been that President Kennedy feared a coup? And was there a possible chance that he saw the threat of being taken out by his enemies?
What Kennedy knew about a growing plan to get rid of him, he's uncertain. He certainly would have known that he had enemies. And I mean, this is one of the things that by the time that Kennedy was shot, there were factions queuing up that would have been very happy to have seen the end of John F. Kennedy and his reign. Whether Kennedy knew of an actual plot, I think is perhaps doubtful. Certainly if he knew of the events of what was going to happen that day, I don't think he would have driven or been driven in an open-top car. So I think he would not have understood that it was getting so near to fruition. But certainly, yes, he knew he had enemies. But, how much he knew, how much the people around him knew is, of course, another story.
While a coup may have been extremely superstitious, theories about who was behind the killing of Kennedy grew larger and larger. If Oswald was not the true killer, then who could have been behind the shooting? And what was their motive? Theories took the idea of a coup against the president and turned their attention towards an extremely high power within the Oval Office, President Kennedy's right-hand man, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson.
So I come to you today full of admiration for Senator Johnson, full of affection for him, strongly in support of him for majority leader, and I'm confident that in that position, we're all going to be able to work together. Thank you.
Lyndon B. Johnson is, of course, a famous president, but I have to say the target of a number of conspiracy theories, and especially when it comes to Kennedy. So he was more than happy, I think, to be released from the Kennedy years, and he had ascended to where he wanted to be. But he very quickly attempted to move on from the Kennedy years. He reversed some of Kennedy's policies very quickly. I mean, Kennedy had initially supported action in Vietnam, for instance, to help the South Vietnamese, fight off the North Vietnamese communist forces. But Kennedy had begun to make it clear that he didn't think that was ever going to work. There was talk that he was going to withdraw US forces from there. Johnson didn't agree with that at all. So as soon as Kennedy was gone, Johnson actually reversed that and was by and large responsible for the main surge of US action in Vietnam, thus setting, the course for a lot of horror, which would then follow. Johnson's mistress, a lady called Madeleine Brown, she is on record as saying that she had heard Johnson saying to her that, effectively implying that he was part of a plot to kill Kennedy. Now, some cast doubt on the statement she made, but it's strange that she would say that. She certainly, believed that Johnson had been involved. Johnson has been accused by his detractors of having been involved with corruption in the years before he was vice president. And indeed, he has been accused by some of having murders taken place by hiring the hitman Mac Wallace. And some have accused Mac Wallace of being one of the gunmen who was, also present trying to take out Kennedy, one of the extra gunmen on top of Oswald. So, the Johnson connection is something that's grown over the years. And certainly, I don't believe Kennedy would have thought that Johnson would have taken him out, but he would have certainly known that Johnson wasn't happy. And there are films of, Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, of course, who was working closely with him, next to him, giving speeches, doing things, and Johnson sitting there looking very unhappy. You can see it in his face, you can see it in his body language. Now, that doesn't prove he was a murderer, but nonetheless, it's clear Johnson would have benefited from the removal of Kennedy and, of course, then did indeed become president. So, that's where you are then saying, well, this is a very high-level conspiracy.
But if Johnson was to be behind the murder of America's commander-in-chief, that would mean that things were a lot darker than people thought and went a lot deeper, with conspiracy theorists turning their focus on to the CIA and FBI's involvement. The theory stated that President Kennedy and his liberal-leaning agenda threatened the establishment and wanted to change things from within.
I believe he had more enemies within our own government than all of the Russians and all them combined. He was more hated within our own government. I believe that today.
Kennedy had been making many enemies, and he had been taking actions which, many people thought were good actions. But, the people that he was trying to basically take away powers from, they didn't want this to happen. I mean, just to give one example, he created an executive order, which means that basically the president can do what he wants to do, to curtail some of the powers of the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve is seen as the Bank of America, but is really a private enterprise that many people are worried is deeply corrupt and was set up on corrupt grounds. He wanted to take back some of their power. He wanted to give more powers to the US Treasury. So he would have made enemies amongst the bankers. He also was making enemies amongst what we call the military-industrial complex. So yes, he had been supportive of war in Vietnam initially, But then as he began to see, I think, more closely where that was really going to go, he started to pull back on that. Well, war is business, war is money. And the last thing anybody wanted was a peacenik president. So I think there was concern there that he might start to take away the chances that war in Vietnam offered for many people.
The events and decisions of the next 10 months may well decide the fate of man for the next 10,000 years. There will be no avoiding these events. There will be no appeal from these decisions, and we in this hall shall be remembered either as part of the generation that turned this planet into a flaming funeral pyre, or the generation that met its vow to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war.
He was also not happy with the powers of the CIA. Now, the CIA, of course, are accused of many things in conspiracy law, but certainly they are very shadowy, they are very powerful. And Kennedy had made it clear he felt they had too much power. So there would certainly have been CIA factions that would have been worried about where that might have gone. And they, of course, you know, they're involved with the intelligence services all around. You have the Secret Service, you have the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover was not a fan of Kennedy. Some have implicated the FBI being involved too. There are endless possibilities, but the bottom line is that Kennedy wasn't really playing the game. He was standing up now against the global elite that I think certainly his father, Joseph Kennedy, would have expected his son to have supported. And now, perhaps to the surprise of many people, he wasn't supporting it. And a lot of people would have thought, right, enough's enough. Let's let this president go.
Further proof of this theory came from the events of 1962 and President Kennedy's wish to create a policy of nuclear disarmament after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This policy, however, did not sit well with military officials, as well as other big corporate names.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. Only last Thursday, as evidence of this rapid offensive buildup was already in my hand, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
In 1962, there had been what we call the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's where it was discovered that the Soviets were storing missiles on the island of Cuba, which of course is very near to America. And when this became public, that was a very dangerous moment in our history. Kennedy had to decide, did he bomb those missile sites? Did he threaten the Soviets? Would they retreat? Would they take the missiles away? So it was, you know, a time when probably we got the closest to nuclear conflict that we ever had. Now, in the end, what Kennedy did was say to the Soviets, right, we're going to put Cuba into quarantine. If you try and bring any more missiles into Cuba, we will board your ships. And there was one boarding of a Soviet ship. But luckily, the Soviet president, Nikita Khrushchev, he, I think, could see that this was very dangerous. He pulled back, and he did a deal with Kennedy that if he removed the missiles from Cuba, that Kennedy would promise not to invade Cuba. And that's something which I think then did lead to the peace that then followed. But some people felt Kennedy had sold out.
I get a sense that Castro knew that they killed Kennedy because Kennedy was looking for détente with both the Cubans and the Russians. Kennedy wanted peace, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I want to take this opportunity to report on the conclusions which this government has reached on the basis of yesterday's aerial photographs, namely that the Soviet missile bases in Cuba are being dismantled, their missiles and related equipment are being crated, and the fixed installations at these sites are being destroyed. The United States intends to follow closely the completion of this work through a variety of means, including aerial surveillance, until such time as an equally satisfactory international means of verification is effective. The continuation of these measures in air and sea is in keeping with our pledge to secure their withdrawal or elimination from this hemisphere. And it is in keeping with the exchange of letters with Chairman Khrushchev of October 27th and 28th. We will continue to keep the American people informed on this vital matter.
There was one theory that seemed to have been swept under the rug, but it was a theory which followed the narrative of President Kennedy's plot against the communist regime. This theory placed the Cuban leader Fidel Castro as the main culprit and stated that it was Castro and the Soviet state who were actually behind the assassination of Kennedy.
My friends, I close on a note of hope. We are not lulled by the momentary calm of the sea or the somewhat clearer skies above. We know the turbulence that lies below and the storms that are beyond the horizon this year. But now the winds of change appear to be blowing more strongly than ever in the world of communism, as well as our own.
Fidel Castro was, of course, the leader of Cuba. And, you know, he had set up a communist state so near to American soil. So that he did worry many Americans. And we'd come out of the McCarthy years where, you know, anything remotely communist-leaning was seen as a massive threat, and many people got blacklisted. And, you know, if you were a commie, you were out of a career for a long while. So there was a lot of concern about Castro. And President Eisenhower had been planning an invasion of Cuba. And so when Kennedy came to power after Eisenhower, he felt perhaps that he ought to, you know, perhaps go along with this. But I don't think he was ever entirely comfortable with it. And the Bay of Pigs invasion was a failure, I think, partly because Kennedy did not give full sort of, you know, backing. But if you're a Cuban, nonetheless, that was an invasion. Or an attempted invasion. And many Cubans were not happy at all with Kennedy. So yes, there certainly would have been another faction there that would have wanted revenge against Kennedy. And Oswald, we are told, was a sympathizer towards the Cubans, although some say in the double agent idea, actually, he was anti-Cuba. But, you know, these are the arguments that go round and round. But nonetheless, his Cuba always seems to come up somewhere down the line. And it was certainly a big thing back then. But the communist sort of society, of course, was the big enemy. And what's interesting is, had the Americans managed to blame the communists on the shooting of Kennedy, they could have actually triggered conflicts against the Soviet Union had they wanted to. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think there was a genuine concern that that could lead to a nuclear war. So actually, there are many signs that after the killing of Kennedy, any indications that it could have been to do with Cuba or the Soviet Union or any links there were played down, because nobody wanted anything that would lead to a nuclear conflict. And again, the military-industrial people, yes, they might want to make money, but they don't want to blow up the world, because then they won't make any money after that. So actually, you know, Cuba, the communist side of it, it's something that got played down, perhaps surprisingly, when you would have thought they would have been easy people to blame, because some people were worried that this could lead to, you know, an international nuclear conflict.
Conspiracies continue to explore the day of President Kennedy's death. Could it have been the Soviet state? Could it have been the American establishment? Or could it have been Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone gunman within the Texas School Book Depository? But in 1968, a string of other harrowing public events only emphasized the Kennedy conspiracy and caused more citizens of the world to question who or what was really behind the death of the president.
It was on an extremely hot afternoon last June that a young, vigorous, intelligent, dedicated president stood before the nation, said in eloquent terms that the issue which we face in civil rights is not merely a political issue, it is at bottom a moral issue. Our nation has known a dark day and a dreary night. That same president was cut down by an assassin's bullet on Elm Street in Dallas, Texas. And I think the passage of the Civil Rights Bill is a lasting tribute to the memory of the late John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Too long, we have dealt with these deadly weapons as if they were harmless toys. Yet their very presence, ease of their acquisition, and the familiarity of their appearance have led to thousands of deaths each year and to countless other crimes of violence as well.
Robert Kennedy himself was shot dead in 1968 in a Los Angeles hotel in a kitchen full of people at effectively point-blank range. Even there are arguments. It's blamed on a man called Sharon, who was standing to the front of Robert Kennedy, but some say the damage to the head looks like a shot came from behind. Maybe it was both. So even that is not straightforward. Why kill Robert Kennedy? Well, he had just made an announcement, in effect, that he wanted to run for president. And if people feared that he would then try to take up the more liberal sort of Kennedy policies that he'd been involved with before, again, it's then a threat to all the people that took out Kennedy. So, you know, there were many people that would have been, again, very happy to remove that threat of a new Kennedy sort of dynasty, if you like, coming forward. But Martin Luther King was shot dead around the same time. Again, he had been having huge effects on civil society, and, you know, racial discrimination was a major factor back then, a big problem. That was something which Kennedy himself, although to begin with, he'd been a little bit reluctant to join the civil rights movement, in the end, he did get on board, and he was seen as a hope for that. And Robert Kennedy absolutely would have been all for that. So taking out Robert Kennedy and taking out Martin Luther King, you know, would have been useful for anybody that felt threatened by that. Many conspiracy theories, of course, believe that, you know, the person that killed Martin Luther King was part of something much, much wider. And this is the problem. You might have one person pull a trigger, but it still doesn't explain all the many people that might be behind that, putting them up to it.
In 1978, citizens of America were desperate to learn more about the day of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, on that November's day in 1963. In a plea to reopen the investigation, another version of the Warren Report was issued by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. But unfortunately, this second investigation did not answer any of those long-awaited questions and theories.
Especially after Robert Kennedy is gunned down, people begin to become more suspicious. They start to look back at it, and by the mid-1970s, especially after Watergate, where now you find that even the president can't be trusted, which back then was a big deal, this starts to make people look back. And Kennedy, you know, his assassination, it had never felt comfortable in the collective gut. So in the end, there was such a clamour for a new investigation that in 1979, a paper was produced by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. They looked into not only the Kennedy assassination, but also Martin Luther King. And it was really, again, a little bit of a whitewash. they were starting to find really interesting things, and then they were told to hurriedly come to a conclusion. They didn't get the funding they thought they would get. So, but nonetheless, the opening that offered was that it did have to accept that there probably, and that's the word they use, probably was a wider conspiracy, and it acknowledges the likelihood of more than one gunman being present. And although it kind of implies it was probably the mob or the mafia and leaves it hanging, nonetheless, you know, that actually is the official position, is that it wasn't a lone gunman. There probably was a wider conspiracy. And when you look at polls as to what people believe, that seems to be what most people in their gut believe. Although, interestingly, as the years go by, and I think we are being bred to be a far more conformist society, the people that believe that Kennedy died through a mass conspiracy actually gets less. They're still in the majority. But as people lose the link to the past, they weren't there, they don't remember it, and we are told to be more conformist and trust authority more, just curious to see how that's reversing, which those that believe we should investigate conspiracies will see as a worrying trend.
It has been over 5 decades since the events of the 22nd of November, 1963, with the world still feeling the effects of that day. Throughout the past few decades, presidents such as Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and George W. Bush have all stated they would release private documents regarding the assassination of John F. Kennedy. To this date, some of those documents have still been withheld by the establishment. But have we learned anything new about the case since the last investigation in 1978?
There are periodically releases of government papers. We had some just a few years ago that certainly did release a lot of new information. What I found interesting, though, was that the media were given the impression, or they gave the impression, that there wasn't really any new material there. It was just more detail on what we knew. But that actually wasn't true. And there were things like minutes of meetings or speeches that had been recorded at the time that made it very clear that even a few weeks after the shooting, people knew that there was more than one gunman. And that's important because, you know, at the time you might think everybody thought it was a lone gunman. But when you look at some of the papers written back then, many people knew very quickly that that wasn't the case. There are more papers to come out, and perhaps we will learn more. But of course, ultimately, if you are the kind of shadowy intelligence service that still, even more than 50 years on, doesn't want the world to know what your part might have been in that, you are going to find a way not to release that document. You might say you've released all the documents, but will they be? Or will they be forever redacted? Or, you know, you will just never hear about them. I think we can be very sure that we will never see all the real documents. And we will be told, I'm sure, we've got all the real documents, but that's classic conspiracy thinking.
We may never learn the full truth on what happened on that sunny winter's day in November 1963. Conspiracies will forever circulate as we try to explore the possibilities of a second shooter, establishment involvement, and a coup against the president. Lee Harvey Oswald to this date is still the prime suspect and the listed assassin of John F. Kennedy. But as stated in the second investigation, there quite possibly was a second shooter in the assassination. But will we ever uncover the truth of who was behind the assassination and who this second shooter could have been? Or will this forever be the ultimate conspiracy? Only time can tell.
Personally, he's the greatest president we ever had. And you know how you know that? he served the least amount of time. They wouldn't even let him do one term. That showed his greatness right there.
After Kennedy died, some saw that really as the end of a hope for a much more liberal society. You know, and I think some people probably look back with rose-tinted glasses at how life under Kennedy would have been, and, you know, they believe everything would have been marvelous and rainbows everywhere. I don't think it would have been quite like that, but nonetheless, I think we did step back to a more authoritarian way, a more warlike way. And I think what we saw with certainly, you know, Johnson and later on Nixon coming in and the long wars in Vietnam and absolutely allowing people that make money from war to call the shots and allowing the establishment very much to, you know, do what they need to do ultimately. I do suspect that has been worse than it might have been had Kennedy survived. Because I think, you know, maybe somewhere down the line somebody would have attempted to have curtailed Kennedy anyway. But nonetheless, I think that certain strong factions that still now have enormous influence today, which some might call the New World Order, they might have had less power had Kennedy gone on. If we say that the intelligence services were involved in the killing of Kennedy, then we are effectively saying this was a coup d'etat. And certainly the accusations that Johnson was involved would very much make that a coup d'etat. The problem with that, and here are the ramifications for the future, are that if you have, you know, history changed by such an event, you can be very sure they've tried to do that since, albeit not quite so obviously. And there are big conspiracy theories since involving everything from 9/11 to various world events that believe that we see this kind of thing actually quite often. And again, the world is persuaded they are merely mad conspiracy theories. But I think the evidence is fairly strong that at the very least, there was knowledge on the part of the intelligence services with the killing of Kennedy. And therefore, we have to say that we have forever been in their clutches in the years since. And sadly, until somebody comes along that really is willing to shake that world up, we'll probably go on for a good while longer.